This presentation is brought to you by the MFOA.
Hello everyone, and welcome to MFOA's webinar on Development Charges Update Announcement and what it means for your municipality. And now I'd like to introduce your presenters. Trevor Bingler has been the Director of the Municipal Finance Branch in the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing for 5 years. Prior to stepping into this role, he served the Ontario government at Cabinet Office and the Ontario Growth Secretariat, where he was the Manager and Acting Director of the Growth Policy Branch. His work on the Places to Grow initiative and the Growth Secretariat earned him an Amethyst Award from the Ontario Public Service. He was also a member of the GFOA and has served on their Committee on Canadian Issues. Gary Scanlon, Director of Watson & Associates Economics Limited, has over 30 years of experience with development charges and the former lot levies. Gary has prepared in excess 200 DC studies, has negotiated numerous agreements with developing landowners on behalf of municipalities, and has been before the OMB on DC matters on many occasions. Greg Binning is a partner with Hempson Consulting Limited, a Toronto firm that specializes in providing planning and finance advice to a wide range of public sector clients. His particular areas of expertise include economic and financial impact modeling analysis, cost-benefit assessment, user fee calculation, rate setting, local government policy, land use economics, and development charges and municipal asset management. We're very excited to have all parties here today, and this is our agenda for the day. We're going to have DCA legislative updates, key impacts and issues in DCs. Then we're going to talk about the most popular registration questions. We're going to open up the forum for the virtual floor to ask questions, and then we will have closing remarks. And then we're going to take it, hand this off to Trevor Bingler, and yes, take it away.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank the MFOA for the invite. It's always exciting to talk about development charges. Believe me, I'd rather be here talking to you guys about this than sitting in outside the cabinet doors waiting for decisions on it. So it's great to be here. It's great to get to a spot where we can actually talk about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time setting this up. As you're all well aware, we've actually been working on this for a while. October in 2013 is when we actually started the review process. It feels more like 1997 than 2013. But the good news is we actually have the bill in the House now. We're ready to move forward. The only thing I wanted to mention before going through it at a relatively high level, the key changes to the Act is that just keeping in mind sort of that this was a scope review of the Act, therefore that kind of points to the areas we're focusing on, as well as the fact that we're always trying to balance some very competing interests with respect to both the municipal interests and the development community and other interests as well. So I know you've heard that from me before. Most of you probably participated in some form or other in our consultation, so I hope you see some of your feedback in the legislation, but if not, I'm happy to entertain the questions on why I didn't make it there. So really quickly, on Bill 73, what I want to do is hit the high notes. And so before I do, I'm obligated to say that I'm not a lawyer and that we're talking about a bill that's before the House, so obviously it's subject to approval of the legislature. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'll try not to be too lawyery when I'm talking, but I always stress that because it is an important point that there is some decisions that still need to be made around this. And as much as I want these things to happen, they do need to follow a process. The other point I wanted to make a point about right off the bat, and hopefully this answers some of the questions that were out there, was around timing. And that's where, if you've noticed the way we've designed the bill going forward, and in the press release, we talk about it being a two-step process. So what we've done for the legislation, for the most part, is given ourselves regulatory authority to make some changes down the road, subject to some additional consultation through a working group. And I'll touch on that in more detail later, but the DCA was probably a little bit convoluted to begin with respect to how we sort of state, eligibility and ineligibility, but that plays into the way we've worded some of the regulatory authority. So hopefully it makes sense to you. If not, I can try to explain it, but we're also trying to sort of keep it to fit within the existing framework. So with that in mind, talking about the sort of the key proposed amendments, the first one would be the removal of the mandatory 10% discounts for transit services. That was a big one that we heard loud and clear from the sector. The other one is the collection of levies for services and facilities related to waste diversion. That is something that obviously would require a regulatory amendment as well, but we're signaling that right up front as well. The hope being that, and this isn't just for this component, but sort of a basket of regulatory changes we want to make, we're hoping that we'll actually have, if everything goes according to plan, regulations ready for when the legislation is actually, hopefully will achieve third reading. So there won't be a big lag between, we actually get the legislation, but guess what? Until the regulations are done, we can't do anything. That's the plan, at least. The next component I wanted to touch on briefly is creating the authority to identify the ineligibility of services exclusively through regulation. So again, giving us the flexibility down the road to address eligibility. Also creating the regulatory authority to identify services for which an alternative service level calculation can replace the 10-year historical service level. So clearly the one that we've talked about the most, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, is for transit, but it's obviously something that there can be a dialogue on other services as well. Another big component, and one that probably is going to get a lot of questions, is around the stronger public reporting requirements. So that's basically something that I don't think we're going a lot further with respect to DCs. I think we're probably moving in the direction of best practices for what a lot of municipalities and jurisdictions do already. But what we are doing, and this is where I'm going to touch on the Planning Act, and by no means am I a planner, so please don't ask me too many tough questions on these ones, but for the density bonus in the Section 37, we're also requiring annual reporting for that as well, and as well as for the parkland dedication fees as well. So those are two areas we're trying to, we're moving to best practices on DCs. We're making linkages, and I think really important linkages to asset management planning on the DC front, and then we're kind of raising the bar on the annual reporting for Section 37 of parkland dedication. I'm sure probably the vast majority of you are already reporting to council on these things as well, so I don't think it's a huge stretch, but again, sort of just getting that standardization and that move to a best practice. To touch on really briefly, I'm not sure how much there's interest in the room on this one, but also in the Planning Act, there was a modification to way the alternative parkland dedication rate for cash and lieu was modified. I can go into more detail on that one if you want, but I just wanted to point that out as well. And there's also a requirement for if you utilize the alternate parkland dedication rate for a parks plan, which again is a bit of a best practice that's being utilized in the sector already. Moving on, the other component of the legislation that we're looking at is just clarifying and strengthening some of the language around what is permitted under the Act and what is not permitted under the Act. This is kind of getting at trying to better define voluntary payments and what's legal and what's not legal. There's also the introduction of something called a compliance certificate for treasurers, and this is what I equate this to being at the provinces. Because probably for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been required director level up to sign off on what we call a certificate of assurance. So basically what that says is I'm doing everything in compliance with the financial legislative framework, regulatory framework that I have to under at the province. So very similar approach for development charges, and one that I think will fully satisfy any concerns around transparency under the DCA. There's also an additional investigative authority. Now this is a bit duplicative because, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the minister already has the authority to investigate municipalities, but we just added that into the Act as well to make it clear what the potential role could be for the minister, and also require that, or potentially make the requirement that a municipality cover the cost of a compliance investigation. Just pausing there for a second, for those of you that know me and know my branch, I don't have an army of investigators of municipalities, so I'm not anticipating this to be a massive new undertaking or new area, but it is something that there is a definite desire to have those authorities in place. Moving on, another component of the Act will be requiring that so I guess some greater clarity around when development charges should be calculated and payable, and it will reiterate that they will be payable as of the first issuance of the first multiple building permit issuance. And I'm in the home stretch here, so hopefully I haven't put anyone to sleep yet. We also are going to require municipalities to consider the broader use of area-rated levies when implementing their development charges. What we're getting at here is differentiated development charges across the municipality based on sort of the geographic specific infrastructure needs. A lot of communities already do this, right? I don't know if Markham is on the line or not, but you're going to be yawning at this saying, well, yes, of course we do this. We have a number of rates within our DC bylaw to deal with this. What this is doing is just asking all municipalities who have a DC bylaw to consider this as part of this process. So basically going to the best practice of including that. It also provides an authority for the ministry down the road to mandate the use of area-rated development charge levies. Just to give you a bit of a background on that one, there was definitely a desire, and if you follow sort of the academic community in this area, especially around areas of growth management, there is some literature that would suggest that development charges play a really important role in how communities get built out and the type of density that's in these communities. Some would argue that the way we calculate development charges right now is a disincentive for that. I don't think there was conclusive evidence of that during our consultation process. So, and I'm just going to, maybe I'll dovetail right into a discussion on the working groups, or the proposed working groups, that I think that that's something we need a lot of work on. So this is basically giving us the authority to go back and be more prescriptive down the road, but I don't think we have a definitive direction on that yet. So really quickly, hopefully my time's okay. I want to talk a little bit about next steps in the working groups because I know there's a lot of interest in that. So just today, we finalized direction on that, and I've been reaching out to members, key stakeholders of the steering committee. So just to give you a bit of a background on what the thinking is on this, is that we are looking to form a steering committee of our key stakeholders. So obviously the municipal sector is a big one. I've already been in, I guess I'm not telling secrets here, but I've already reached out to MFOA to ask them to be a member of that steering committee, as well as AMO. We're looking obviously for members of the development industry as well, and the NGO community as well. And that will be a steering committee for that. The areas that we really think there's the need for further consideration, and this is the one in my area, this is my most important one, is the planned service level for transit. That is something that I want to have as sort of the first item of business. We're also going to be looking at the consideration of all eligible services, the applicability and implementation of area rating, so that whole differentiated development charges that I talked about earlier. What are we, is there a need to be more directive around that? Is there something that we can do? Removal of the 10% mandatory discount for services beyond transit is also something we want to talk about. And the eligibility list of development charges as well is something that we want to have. We did have a fair amount of dialogue on it. I think outside of the waste diversion component, there wasn't a ton of discussion or a ton of consensus on what else we need to do, but we're happy to have that discussion again. What we see happening is for these very technical issues, we're really looking for the steering committee to appoint subgroups or technical working groups to deal with these issues and bring in the technical expertise that we require to get the best opinions and options for the minister's consideration. There's been a lot of discussion of, well, how are you going to form these working groups? Who's going to be involved? Who's not going to be involved? What I can tell you is that we are going to be looking for recommendations from our steering committee members on the composition of that, but ultimately it will be a decision of the minister for who will participate. I think logically we're going to have some opinions on who to include in these working groups if we're talking about transit and a planned service level and what that's going to look like, a forward-looking service level. I would really, really appreciate if we could get members from the municipalities that are making some significant investments in higher order transit in the near future. That's something that I think is really, really important. Having said that, these groups aren't going to be big, so we're not going to be able to invite everyone. So I hope that nobody is offended if they don't necessarily get included, but keep in mind that by the participation of the MFOA, I think that your opinions and thoughts will be well represented, and there will definitely be opportunities through things like a regulatory registry posting and other opportunities at committee for legislation for you to also express your individual municipal interests. So that's basically it for me. I hope I got the big questions out of the way, but I know that we're going to be doing a Q&A later on, and I'll be happy to delve into a little bit more detail on the legislation and any questions of clarification you may have.
All right, thank you so much, Trevor. Next, we'll proceed to transit service. All right, Gary, take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Trevor. It's I think it's given a good insight into some of the slides that both Craig and I will be going over. Obviously, there's some of the details are going to be left to the working group. So we're going to try our best to give some perspectives on things that we think need to be addressed, maybe with the broader groups as we go through these slides. Transit first, and actually this is kind of a combined one with Craig and I. We both obviously do transit, but then there's some specialized areas such as Go Transit and then the subways and such where we both individually have some additional perspectives. So this one it's kind of combined, but I'll lead with it. The change, as Trevor's mentioned, there's some adjustments to the service. Sorry about that, excuse me. First one is to remove the 10% mandatory deduction. So it would move it in with services such as the water, wastewater, storm, roads, etc. And that automatically removes it from the 10% deduction. Moving it into that category as well, those categories aren't limited to 10-year planning horizons. So with the exception of water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, and fire, everything else is limited to a 10-year period. That's why you can see that I've indicated it as a 10-year plus service now. The last one is it's going to be forward-looking, so the service standards will be established by trying to achieve targets or levels into the future, and that's what we'll be planning on as driving the amount of the capital cost and the level of service, so to speak, definition. Obviously, potential impact on DCs if we're removing the 10%, if we're removing the service standard restrictions, then we should see the development charge increase over time. In theory, we should probably see a reduction to some extent in the roads DC. What's been happening with roads over the last probably 15 years is when we're looking at transportation master plans, and that's what the TMP is later in the slide. Transportation master plans really are looking at growth, taking a look at average amount of trips per capita or trips per household. And when they're looking at that, then they kind of estimate the total number of trips per day which will be generated by new growth. And from that, then they start to break it apart into what's called a modal split. So they'll assign that 85% of the trips will be by roads, 10% will be by transit, and then 5% by alternative transit methods such as riding bikes, walking, etc. And over time, through the official plans, through provincial legislation, we're being moved towards more alternatives to road traffic. So these changes are moving in the right direction to help municipalities try and achieve those goals. So with that, I mean, I think when we get into the potential impact on the municipality, I think what we'll see is we're going to have more integrated planning through the transportation master plans, trying to balance off roads and other needs in order to accommodate all different types of pedestrian or goods movement. The municipality, therefore, is going to have to probably spend a little bit more time, a little bit more thought in how they want to achieve these transportation goals. Issues, concerns, obviously, I noted that some of this is going to be left to the working committee, so we're unclear right now of the definitions and the requirements at this point. But I think some of the things that we should be mindful of is, and especially when we get into these groups, is traditionally everybody just thinks that transit is buses. But from the infrastructure perspective, it's far broader than that. We have buses, but then we have, the facilities that house them, mechanical or for storage. We've got transit terminals, which are where all of the buses kind of congregate, and you're able to switch off pedestrians, or they're almost like a big pedestrian walkway or mallway where the buses pull in and change over. We've got dedicated bus lanes. We have BRTs, which may be huge transit shelters and such on main either highways or roads, etc. So there's a lot more infrastructure that we have to be embracing when we're looking at a forward-looking service. So historic service measurements such as bus per capita or whatever, they're not working, and we need to look at the full, almost like your road system, an integrated transportation system. One thing that we have, I guess, and I've kind of expressed this concern with through this process that we've had, is it's not clear how we're going to be able to integrate the service. We've got Go Transit at the high level, servicing the GTA and then the outer rim. And then, as you move down, there's many municipalities that provide the service at the local level. And then in between, the local and the province, we've got the region starting to get in to provide dedicated bus lanes and such. So right now we've got a 3-tier system, 2 tiers in some jurisdictions, but potentially a 3-tier system of transit. And we have to try and figure out how these objectives or whatever are going to integrate so that we're not either putting up a roadblock or potentially losing out on the ability to fund the needed services. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Craig right now. I think he'd like an opportunity to add some additional comments and perspectives. So I'll hand you over to him.
Great, thanks, Gary, and thanks to Trevor as well for doing such an excellent introducing the general topic. Just to follow on from some of Gary's comments on the transit, is just to, I think one of the interesting things that we find, and one of the things that many of us have often argued about under the current construct of the DCA, is because transit being 90% cost recovery and the roads at 100%, that we couldn't look at the services in a combined overall sort of holistic transportation perspective because of the inability to combine them into one category of service. So it's interesting to see under the proposed change whether or not we'll now be able to be more consistent with the way that municipalities that are responsible for both transit and roads look at this issue, and as Gary referenced, modal splits and how we're trying to achieve some of the planning objectives as well through higher order transit and enhanced transit. And I think this potentially gives us the opportunity to look at it as a collective service. But in my opinion, and certainly based on some of the recent experience with places like Mississauga, I think we're going to end up with a greater level of scrutiny from the development industry in terms of how we quantify the service level, whether it's a historic one or a planned one moving forward. And we're going to have to really work towards that as a group, municipalities and your consultants. And I would echo Gary's comments about the transportation master plan and other servicing plans related to this, and that we should be diligently trying to develop within those kinds of studies measures of service level, both looking backwards but also looking forwards, to allow us to have a good, strong, defensible program moving forward. In the last round with Mississauga, I mean, we were beginning to explore some of these things. Both they did themselves through their work on the transportation master plan, but also we began to look at things with respect to transit, and especially the impact of overall congestion in the city with respect to service levels. And we looked at things like the headways and how much additional transit infrastructure would be required in order to maintain headways or overall trip times, and we're still sort of working with that and to be honest, defending it before the municipal board. I do think it's also interesting, this notion of the planned level of service moving forward. And of course, that in some way echoes what was already done through the Spadina subway extension with both the City of Toronto and the region of York. And learning off of that, we're currently doing work also here in Toronto on the Scarborough subway extension. And effectively, we're using more of a planned level of service there by looking at the trips that will be generated and the capacity at a peak hour per direction kind of analysis. And I think that's one way of potentially doing this, looking forward measures. And I'm sure that we're all, both the consultants and the municipalities, going to explore these things more fully. So those are sort of my comments on transit. I'm sure we'll come back to it to the Q&A, and I'm pleased to pass it back to Gary now on some of the other topics.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. Those were good comments. I'm going to move on to a couple of the other topics that Trevor's gone over. Waste diversion, as was noted, this was one of the ones, and I think perhaps AMO was advancing this historically. Right now, waste management service is an ineligible service. And but it would appear that a subcomponent of that being waste diversion, would become an eligible municipal service for DC purposes. Obviously, the impact of this is to be able to increase the development charge, and basically give you more funding towards this particular service. Once again, I think with this particular one, we're going to have forward-looking service standards that are going to look to try and achieve certain objectives. Now, it's not clear what those objectives are. I mean, historically, when we used to have, this was an eligible service prior to 1997. And when we were getting in and doing different types of measurements, I mean, you know, there was the measurements of trying to achieve certain levels of recycling or reuse or diversion from your waste stream. So I'm not clear, and I guess this is to be discussed, how we're going to achieve some of these objectives. We've got things historically, recycle and reuse, I guess, were the main diversion. But in recent times, we've been evolving into organic byproducts. So Guelph, for example, they have separation of their organics. And even I was just driving past one of the trucks. They now have everything in bins, and the trucks automatically pick up these bins and sort the materials into different components areas of their vehicle. So this is advancing quite a bit from what we've seen historically. And then we're going to get other types of interesting diversions. I was just one of my staff just passed on something where they're looking at recovery of oil from different types of plastics and such. So it'll be interesting in this one to be able to set objectives that, number one, don't restrict potential changes or new technologies that are coming into the future, but also help to embrace an environmental concept, and by the same token allow municipalities to provide for full cost recovery. As I say, there's no...
Sorry, Gary.
Yep.
Right, sorry, it's Trevor. Can I just jump in for a second just to clarify?
You're my guest.
Yeah, sorry. So I should have said, probably given a little bit more detail on that one when we're talking about waste diversion and my component. But what I can say, and this is kind of one of those nuances of the Act where we kind of define something by what it can't be. So the way we're looking at defining that regulation right now would be waste diversion is essentially everything that isn't landfill or incineration. So we wanted to keep it open-ended, so exactly for the points that you're raising, that you could talk about organics facilities, you could be talking about recycling facilities, like all the things you talked about. So I think we're going to probably kind of keep it at that level, and just as you know, aside from landfilling and incineration, it'll be open.
Excellent. Well, thank you for clarifying that. So then that does you know, take us into broader technologies that we're going to see over time. It's not clear right now. Similar transit was dropped into a category where the 10% deduction didn't apply, as a result, is looked at over a longer period of time, 10 plus years. So we'll wait to see how this gets handled within the regulations that'll be coming out. I'll leave that now and be looking to talk a little bit about service standards. Presently, most of the service standards are measured on the Act and the regulations provide for quality quantity measures. And that works for many of the services, if you're talking about buildings or vehicles or such. It's always been a little bit challenging when we've gone into roads to use that type of approach. And fortunately, it's you don't have to do it for things such as water, wastewater, and storm. But as we move forward, as has been talked about, we're going to be looking at a different form, which is in use, as Craig was indicating, for the subway extension. So we'll be looking at a more forward-looking approach. Now, the way that the Act has talked about it is mentioning to plan the service over a 10-year post, 10 years past your DC background study. So it's a 10-year planning horizon. That seems okay, I guess, except that if we're looking at if this is applying to services that really can be forecasted over a 20-year period, such as transit moving into this realm, I just point out that seems that it may cause some bumps along the way in having a service measurement that's to some extent lesser than your planning horizon for that service. We would see that obviously moving from a historic-looking service standard to a forward-looking, that it should provide for more funding for the municipalities for those services where we're planning, such as transit and waste diversion. The impact of the municipality, I think in order to quantify or to address or to have some form of objective, you're going to have to, it's going to require more background studies and more engineering analysis in order to establish the standards, establish that relationship to growth, and really take a look at the capital cost to achieve those levels. The parameters, I guess, as was noted, we'll be working those out through the working groups. I think it'll probably have to integrate not only a policy, but we're going to have to start to invite perhaps some of the engineers in to assist in some of those determinations. So that's about all I can say at this particular point, but it'll be an interesting exercise to say the least. The last area I'm going to talk on, and then I'm going to hand it over to Craig, is to talk about voluntary payments. Within the right now, to give you a little background, these voluntary payments basically arise from a couple of different ways. Number one, probably the easiest situation to consider is if you had a project such as an extension of a water main. You may have been planning a certain level of phasing for development, so you go to your capital budget, you got project A, B, C, and D planned over each of the next 3 or 4 years. You may have a developer that comes in and wants to accelerate the timing of that project, and in order to, because it would probably disrupt your budgeting process, quite often we'll have the development community, if there's a 10 or a 15% existing benefit, quite often the development community are just happy enough to to provide that payment, cover it, so then you don't have to worry about disrupting the capital budget process. Obviously, the alternative is to tell the developer to wait, and that's always a business decision made by the developing landowner. Now, some of the other voluntary payments that we've developed, and our firm's done them on behalf of municipalities such as Milton and Barrie and Caledon and East Gwillimbury, and there's about 4 or 5 others, Wichita, Stouffville, where these kind of municipalities that have been perhaps smaller in size in the early stages they don't necessarily have the financial ability to allow the amount of growth to occur that's either been planned by the province or initiated by the developers themselves. A good example would be back 10 years, I guess 15 years now. Milton was 32,000 people, and they were planned within their official plan. They were planned to grow to somewhere in the range of about 160 to 180,000 people. In order to grow that fast over 20 years, the amount of investment was several $billion. So in their particular case, you're asking a municipality with a limited amount of capital and operating funds and a limited amount of debt capacity to take on a very serious amount of capital projects and basically financing. And when we did the analysis, basically we had things like the debt capacity was going to be at 45%. Property taxes were probably going to raise at a rate of about 6 to 8%. So nothing within that plan really was financially positive to the municipality. And in fact, with the limitations on your debt capacity, it was impossible to achieve. So we negotiated with the development community in order for them to take on some of the cash flow responsibilities, but they also contributed a number of voluntary payments, which was really allowed us to get the debt capacity down to a level that was manageable, was within the provincial limits. So there was an example there where the growth wouldn't happen. We just finished up with Barrie, where we've got they've got their existing built boundary. They've got the ability to accommodate 10 to 12 years worth of growth within the existing servicing, and they have to finance that along with a lot of their state of good repair needs. So their life cycle costing for water mains, sewers, roads, etc. And in order to allow the new lands that they annexed in, there just wasn't the affordability. So once again, sitting down with the development community, working out voluntary payments in order to allow this development to proceed, which is really well in advance of their needs immediately. We once again got into getting the development community to assist in cash flow as well as making some payments, once again to get us back down into our debt capacity realm and to keep the property tax increases in the range of about 5% per year on average. So these voluntary payments have not been used by everybody, but they do serve a purpose in normally allowing the development community to proceed with their development. What's been provided for in the Act, and I provided within the bill, is a direct extraction from the bill, and it says a municipality shall not impose, directly or indirectly, a charge related to development or a requirement to construct a service related to development, except as permitted by this Act or another Act. And it goes on to say that prescribed exceptions may be provided. So really, this isn't within the development charge per se. It'll have no impact on increasing the DC, but it's a complementary charge which helps you deal with the 10% deductions, helps to pick up the existing benefit costs, or where you're growing and your service standards are ultimately going to be higher than where you are today. It's allowed us to deal with a number of those matters. I see this as a problem. As I say, with fast growth municipalities or municipalities that haven't got the financial abilities to deal with the development, it's been something that we've been able to work out through doing financial impact assessments, demonstrating the financial ability of the municipality, and sitting down and negotiating with the developer. So from my perspective, I have seen it as a very positive contribution towards allowing development to proceed. I think if it's taken away, I think we'll probably, there'll be a lot of municipalities, especially in the outer rim, who are the next wave of development. They're not going to be able to accommodate the growth which perhaps the province would be forecasting for them. Obviously, if there was something, if the province has a level of concern, perhaps what you would work out is establishing parameters, maybe a framework, maybe something that has to be demonstrated through a fiscal impact assessment, which would allow first, I guess, a process to dialogue with the province as well as dialoguing with the development community. So I think I'm pretty well to the point where I've concluded my remarks for now. Obviously, we'll be able to chit-chat later in the Q&A session. But I think I'd hand it over now to Craig to undertake his portion of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Gary. I'm just going to pick up and quickly move through the last 4 areas of major change, which Trevor's already introduced, so I'll try to keep it at some of the higher level comments. The first thing I wanted to speak to is the area-specific DECs, and the bill itself uses the word or the phrase area rating rather than area specifics. And the component I want to talk about now is where there's this suggestion that through prescription or through the regulations, that it will be prescribed that municipalities shall calculate and implement area or area-specific DCs or DCs based on an area rating. And it's interesting to note that as part of that prescription through the regulations, it's going to prescribe the municipalities municipality or municipalities, and then it's going to prescribe the area within the municipality, and then the service or service within those areas, within those municipalities that need to be calculated and levied on the area basis. And so that's going to be very interesting, and it sounded to me from Trevor's introduction that obviously that they're going to do that with some thought and caution, which is going to be important, because normally I would suggest that we need the engineering studies and the technical analysis and service studies to determine what the areas might be and even what the services might be that would be differentiated by different pressures in different parts of the municipality. That's certainly the way it's structured and has been done historically in places like Markham and the other municipalities in York Region that use area charges. So I think we need to have some caution there, but the idea that it's going to be a mandatory one is one that we need to be careful about. I guess there's potential different applications, and I'm interested to see how that might work through. We here at Hempson see that potentially there's the application for transit even, for example, in maybe an upper tier municipality that has larger urban centers where the transit infrastructure is going to be focused. Maybe the area rating would be to establish the transit be funded within that transit corridor, whereas the more rural areas or townships would not necessarily be incorporated into the calculations of benefit or revenue recovery. I also thought that whether there was any extension through to the parkland development component tying in with some of the changes under parkland acquisition, but I think that's a bit of a sort of a crystal ball gazing on behalf of myself. The other one, which I think perhaps has more application, and it was alluded to by Trevor, is the notion of intensification and whether or not it would be appropriate to require municipalities to establish charges that would be different, say, within the built-up or older parts of the municipality versus the areas that are receiving more greenfield types of development. And I think that's premised on this notion put forward in some of the academic literature, such as that by Pamela Blay, that would suggest that the cost of meeting demands of development should be less in the built-up areas and in closer proximity to where services are as compared to the greenfield areas. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works through. One of the concerns that I'm going to flag is that, especially if it's all going to relate to any of the general or soft services, there's certain requirements embedded in the current regulations to the Act about how one calculates the service levels and the historical service levels if you're doing area rating. And it creates real limitations on how one might establish the rates. And it's been one of the detrimental reasons why we have not more fully explored area rating for some of the general services. So moving on to talk about some of the additional background study requirements. And there's two things in here that I think are worth talking about a little bit. And the first one follows on from what we were just speaking about. So there's going to be this potential prescribed consideration of area rating or area-specific bylaws, but also now in the background study and the requirements of the background study, we're going to need to give consideration to the use of more than one DC bylaw in a municipality. And I think that's generally can be interpreted once again as doing some kind of area-specific or area rating bylaw. And indeed, the bill uses the language that its stated intention is to reflect different needs for services in different areas of the municipality. So in my opinion, this is quite generic, the wording. It's interesting to note that the word of consideration certainly isn't defined or elaborated on, and I don't know whether that might be through regulation. And also, it's not clear as to whether or not we need to consider that for each and every service in a municipality, and do we consider it sort of in a more collective sense, or is it for the individual services? And so it's unfortunately going to add, in some municipalities anyway, to the level of complexity that is required, and also just how do we meet that test of consideration. It also ties into that concern I raised a moment ago about how we do the service levels if we're going to create sub-areas or different areas within that. Once again, I think this is probably aimed towards having municipalities or requiring them to look at these areas of, is there something that we can do to enhance that term that I don't always like of smart growth, or enhanced urbanization, intensification, and rejuvenization versus accommodating increasing amounts of development through more greenfield areas. The second additional requirement in the background study now is definitely one that I'm sure some municipalities are concerned about, and that is that we now have to incorporate in asset management plan types of analysis into the background study itself. And the way that the bill is reading so far is that it really relates to any infrastructure that is going to be, I would suggest, in whole or in part funded through the DC that are in your background study. So any new libraries, any new fire halls, any new road infrastructure, we're going to have to do an asset management full life cycle costing kind of analysis on that. And it uses the term, once again, that you have to demonstrate that it's financially sustainable. And Gary already alluded to the fact that, you know, we're exploring that both in many municipalities through our studies and through our long-range financial plans, but there's no definition as to what financially sustainable means or what the guidelines are. So it's going to be a bit of a tricky one to do. I would suggest that for many of you, this is not going to be as onerous, at least the asset management component, than it might first appear. I think you're going to be able to rely upon the existing assumptions and rules and factors that you've got in your AMPs. And indeed, many of you probably in your asset management plans have already layered in calculation and provision for new infrastructure that was identified in your development charge background study or other studies. And so it's really just layering that in as an appendix to the background study, presumably. The real trick is probably going to come to how do we address the issue of the financial sustainability. And then moving on to a next point, which is probably even isolated to even fewer municipalities of having some importance or impact, and that's what I've referred to as the timing of the DC collection. And once again, Trevor gave us a bit of an overview, and this is just a modification to the existing provisions, a new subsection being proposed in the Act. And it basically says that if a development of a single building requires more than one building permit, the DC is payable, and in my opinion, effectively set upon the first permit being issued. What this really impacts is on municipalities that are experiencing large tower developments. The City of Toronto probably being the most pronounced in that regard, where you're looking at developments where the first permit can actually be something like the excavation permit, and it may be upwards of 2 years before they come in to draw the permit to actually begin the construction of the units, and the lag time from that very initial building permit to the actual construction and then ultimately the occupation of the dwelling unit or the building itself, if it's an office complex, can be quite long. And the concern from the municipal perspective is that the development charge rates in and of themselves may have changed over that period of time, either due to phase-in of charges or indexing of charges, or even the restatement of the charges through an updated background study. And so there can be some significant revenue impacts for municipalities who are attracting high levels of this type of development. It would also, I would suggest that the developers themselves may be questioning this, or at least some, because if we're going to be required to set the rates at that first building permit, I would suggest that many municipalities are going to also require the payment of the DART charges at that point in time, which once again can be well in advance of when they're even beginning to sell their units or receive some of their revenues. So it's going to be a tricky one, and we're going to have to see how it works within the other permissible sections under the Act with respect to collections. And then really moving on to just the final point that I have is talking about what I refer to as the enhanced annual reporting requirements. And the annual treasury statement requirements under the Act right now, it's really quite straightforward and simply says that first bullet point of having to report the opening and closing balances, and then it uses a term or phrase of in-year transactions. The modified language now being proposed in the bill would say that you have to list all of the assets and capital costs to be funded in the given year. And I think for many municipalities, when you've interpreted the in-year transactions, you've effectively already done that. You're listing the specific projects that are being funded, and if it's spread out over multiple years, you're reporting it that way. However, the second bullet point is perhaps a little bit different from one municipality to the next. And this is something that I think the industry is looking for. They want us to show through the annual reporting now, how are you funding the non-DC fundable shares of those projects? Where are those monies coming from? And they want to be ensured that they actually are being met by non-DC revenue sources. So for some of you, that's certainly going to require an enhancement to your annual reporting. And then I don't have much more to say on the additional statement of compliance, and I thought Trevor did a good job at giving us additional information on that to ensure conformity with the proposed new section 59.1 in terms of dealing with the other development-related charges outside of the DCA or other legislation that Gary was speaking to. So that's the end of my addressing of the sort of formal questions, and I think we're going to open it up now to taking questions, so I'll pass it back to MFOA.
Great, thank you so much. Right now we're going to get to the most popular registration questions. So the first one, will the DCA amendments of new regulations provide clarity on the concept of access capacity? And Trevor will answer that question.
Sure. So I guess the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is I don't. I hadn't envisioned us getting into that level of detail. More generically, what I can say is sometimes we define things vaguely because we want to allow municipalities to interpret them at a local level the way they see fit. And so, I don't think we did anticipate looking at that. Obviously, if it comes up as part of the dialogue around some of the other things I identified as part of the working group, we may have to look at that. But what I want to add, and this isn't just for the excess capacity, but for a lot of stuff that was raised, I think really well by Craig and Gary, is that where possible, I like to avoid being too definitive in regulations, because I find when I'm trying to regulate 444 municipalities, I usually end up angering somebody. So, or creating something that's too stringent for one community, or doesn't meet the needs of another. So, having said that, what I really want to look for, and what we're totally prepared to do, and I think working with MFOA on this is a really good idea, is where we can provide additional direction through tip sheets, through guidance materials. We've committed to doing a DC guide in the near future as well, on some direction on that. We've even actually committed to doing a forum as well at some point down the road. So I would prefer, for some of the things that was talked about, where there's reporting requirements, where you want to get a little bit more detail on what does exactly that mean for me or my community, or I would really like to try to tackle it that way. And then It gives the guidance to municipalities. It sets a bit of a standard, but it also gives you the opportunity to say, well, in this circumstance, we like to tackle it, a little bit differently. So that's sort of a roundabout way of answering question one.
Great, thank you. Second question, what impact is there on smaller and rural municipalities?
It's Gary here. Generally, I don't see a big impact per se on a lot of the changes being proposed. I do see it in three areas, probably, I guess, 3 A's: area-specific, asset management, and annual reporting. The requirement within the Development Charges Act, we will have to be turning our minds to, I guess, disaggregating, or at least potentially thinking about disaggregation by individual areas. So it may add a small amount to the budget process to address that, and then to, I guess, engage the public with those discussions. The other two, asset management and annual reporting, a little bit more on the administrative side. We have to do the asset management link in the DC study, so once again, it might be a little bit more effort on our side. The annual reporting really is the additional work that the staff are going to have to do. Past that, I would say small and rural municipalities probably aren't getting into, there's only 80 municipalities in Ontario that have transit, and I think there's only upwards to about 100 that have waste, who may take on some of the waste diversion. So I don't see really much of an impact from a service perspective.
Great, thank you. Next question, is there any clarity on how to relieve DC credits?
From what we've seen in the Act, there's really not, the proposed changes to the Act. We really don't see anything in there with respect to credits. Normally, credits arise through agreements, so you need to be doing a prepayment agreement, front-ending agreement, a service and placement agreement where the developer puts in, a water main and then wants the credit back, so he recovers the funds. And there's nothing really embracing the existing agreements or any proposed new agreements. So there's no impacts really on, nothing to really discuss on DC credits.
Great, thank you. What is the impact on municipal capital budgeting?
I guess if you are providing any of the proposed the services such as waste diversion or transit, I think the impact would potentially be positive because you're getting more bit more revenue coming in to address those. On the other side, there'll be a little bit higher upfront cost in order to undertake the transportation master plan or whatever the waste management plan that has to be developed to support the waste diversion. You may have to do those studies a little more often, or may have to broaden them in order to accommodate what comes out of the working committees. Other than that, I think other than the extension from the capital budget to do the annual reporting, or the other impact may be if there's something within here that you want to address. Obviously, instead of waiting to the end of 5 years when your bylaws needs to be updated and do the study, you may have to provide a small budget up front in order to address some of these matters. So that's where I see the implications.
Great, thank you so much. The next question, what is the impact of changes on public libraries?
Well, it's Craig again, and I think that the short answer is not too much. Really, the specific things, I think, is you've heard us go through them now. None of them directly impact on the calculation of the library services. It would be only impacted if through some of the prescribed area rating if the library was included as a service. And I think I would be a bit surprised if that was true, but there's no other changes in terms of defining what capital is and the computer equipment and collection materials or any of that that might impact on libraries. So I think it's sort of status quo for that service.
Great, thank you. Next question. What is the impact on urban sprawl?
I think that's a very good question, and I maybe perhaps being a bit bold, but I think it works off well off some of Trevor's introduction comments that really many of the measures being proposed through the bill are either directly or indirectly dealing with issues around growth management and trying to, I would suggest, bring better into sync the Development Charge Act itself with the provincial planning objectives of intensification and accommodating more growth through that means. And so you've got the emphasis on transit reform and allowing the recovery of greater amounts of transit through the development charges. And clearly, I think many of us feel that in order to achieve the levels of density and intensification sought through the growth plan, we do need to enhance all levels of transit, so that's there. And then the other key things are the potential prescribed area rating and the consideration of area-specific charges. As I've already indicated, I think those are aimed at trying to react to some of the academic literature and the pressure from some groups to suggest that we should be doing more of that in an effort to discourage or do more true costing about greenfield development as compared to intensification development. And so if we follow through on those things and they're positive in terms of providing a lower cost base for intensification and a higher cost burden on the urban sprawl, then presumably it would have those kinds of consequences or impacts.
Great, thank you so much for answering those questions. So right now what we're going to do is we're opening the virtual floor for questions. We do have ones that have been submitted throughout the presentation, so we will start off with those. And feel free to raise your hands and we will also answer you as well. So first question. Could municipal water and sanitary sewer services become prescribed services for area-specific development charges? These are services for which many municipalities already use area-specific development charges.
I can start, it's Trevor, I can start with an answer on that one. And I mean, I guess it's a possibility. I don't want to sound, I don't know, be careful, I choose my words here. Like, I think it's worth exploring. I think it's worth looking at. Is there a benefit to being more prescriptive in what you would area rate, not area rate? I'm also wary of being overly prescriptive because I do know that not necessarily on area rating, but just on discounts and incentives and the way municipalities structure their DCs, 3/4 of them are already offering some sort of incentive to direct development in areas where they think there's sort of a public good or importance. So whether it's a brownfields or downtown revitalization or something along those lines. So, maybe, but, we really have to look at that and look at the evidence and drill down a bit. You also have to be careful when you just pick off one service because, again, just speaking very generically, you could be saving monies on one service, but there could be issues around another. So all important things, but all something that we'd want to look at, and that's why we want to have a bit of a discussion at the working group level on it.
Great. Any other comments or answers?
Nope.
Okay. All right, wonderful. So the next question, why aren't municipal land use planners required to sign off on compliance letters?
I'll take a stab at that one as well. So I think the logic behind that is, again, modeling this on the certificate of assurance process and the fact that it deals with the Development Charges Act, it was felt that the most logical municipal representative would be the treasurer for sign off on that.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or answers for that? All right, proceeding to the next one. Are front-ending agreements the same as / captured under the voluntary payments? Comments?
No. Front-ending payments normally, it's scary. Front-ending payments are normally, to be clear, a lot of people call any type of agreement that accelerates money to the municipality as a front-ending within the Act, there's an actual section that deals with front-ending, and it has a lot of legislation and a lot of steps around it. So answering that one first, no, there is provision in there for some recovery not to happen, but generally, and not too many have been done, but when we use this, normally everybody's looking to get full recovery. On the other type of agreements, there may be instances where if you're, building a water main and there was a component of it which is non-growth related, sometimes the developer would just be recovering the DC component and not the other component. So in those type of arrangements, we do see it from time to time, or if they construct it, you can limit the amount of recovery or limit the credit to the amount of the DC per unit. So if you've got a $150,000 water main, he's got 100 units, and you've got a DC of $1,000 a unit. He may only be able to recover $100,000 and leave $50,000 on the table. I'm not quite, that is provided for. I'm in the Act right now, so I'm not sure whether this voluntary payment provision would then go against that other part of the Act.
Craig, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think I would generally agree with Gary, and any kind of prepayment agreements and other mechanisms I don't think fall under those voluntary. And the scenario Gary just described, I think many of us already from the municipal side try to deem those perhaps portions that might not be recoverable through the credit agreement as a local service and defend that under sort of a Planning Act-based contribution and sort of avoid the issue of it being a voluntary. But I agree with Gary, that's an area that we're going to have to focus on as we develop more of those agreements going forward.
Great, thank you. The next couple questions are also about voluntary payment agreements. Will there be transition rules to allow for agreements entered into 2015 before third reading to be still legal and enforceable beyond 2015?
Maybe I'll start and I'll let the experts actually speak to this in more detail, but I'll speak more generically about sort of how I envision transition working for this. Again, reiterating that I'm not a lawyer, but for the authorities where you're getting enabling authorities, where you're basically going to have new authorities to recover things under the DCA, that would likely come into effect as part of the next, once Royal Proclamation is received, that would be the next bylaw you adopt. The issue of compliance with respect to the reporting requirements would typically, once the proclamation is received, it would be the next year.
Great. Does Gary or Craig have anything else to add to that?
Well, I do know, working with at least one of my clients, we're right in a point where we've got a memorandum of understanding from all of the developers within in the developing area, but we haven't got a formal agreement. So if the way everything's worded is that we're okay to continue to proceed for basically deals that have been struck prior to the legislation, then I think we're okay. We'll just have to see what the final wording is as it comes out.
Craig, is there anything you would like to add?
Not specifically on that, just that seeing as we're talking about transition, one of the things I meant to mention under the prescribed area specifics is that it does say under transition that it does not apply to bylaws passed before the relevant areas or services are prescribed. So it's not going to affect your bylaws that are in force now if something in your municipality area or otherwise is prescribed, and you can deal with it in a subsequent study or update.
Great, thank you. And then another follow-up question to voluntary payments is that, does this mean front-ending agreements with developers will no longer be allowed?
No, we did not touch front-ending agreements. I think, Gary, you touched on this a little bit already. That's that framework is still in place.
Great, thank you. Under area-specific DCS, could possible applications include urban water/sewer areas within a rural municipality?
There's no reason why it couldn't. Again, you have the ability now to create area-specific DC bylaws. I think we've touched on this a little bit already in that I think the desire, the push to look at this in greater detail comes from more of an urban lens, looking at addressing growth management issues. But having said that, when we develop, or if we develop additional regulatory authorities or description or prescribed authorities in that area, we will have to take into consideration how it applies in rural areas as well.
Great, thank you. Next question. Should we expect introduction of a planned service level and elimination of the 10% deduction to be extended to services other than transit?
That's part of the discussion of the steering committee. So whether, what recommendations and options come out of that are going to be up to them, but it's something that is part of within that mandate.
Wonderful, thank you. So this is specifically for slide 8, which is from Gary, for voluntary payments again. The Act uses the word charge, but how does that relate to loans/front-ending? Example, in addition to DC payment, funding is received with repayment contingent on future recovery from other developers for something like the post-period capacity. Similarly, the proposed Act indicates except as allowed under other acts, but does Municipal Act not allow for payment agreements from developers, making continuation of voluntary programs possible?
Well, thank you for the easy question. Well, I think there's several different questions in it. Let's start with the simplest. The Municipal Act really there's certain types of agreements defined under the Development Charges Act. Some municipalities have been able to look at certain instances where they've done some things under different parts of the Municipal Act. Generally, you have to use the Development Charges Act, but in some cases, under the Municipal Act, I mean, for local service, we may get into looking at a capital charge for more of the localized services. So they're really outside of the DCA, and having a special charge under the Municipal Act for something that wouldn't be a true DC charge should be okay and should continue. I think if you're doing a special charge or having the developers cash flow the post-period benefit, I think that would still that's fine. You can still do anything. You're not eliminating that charge, and it's really not a voluntary payment. It's a voluntary cash flow agreement, so I don't see a problem. Past that, I guess we'll just have to see how things are structured within the Act. I think, as I said, that's why I kind of qualified what we've been determining as voluntary payments. They're normally to recover the non-DCable components of the charge, the 10%, or if you're exceeding the service standard or ineligible services and such, or the cases where the developer wants to accelerate a payment. So if we inhibit those type of things totally, I think it'll cause problems. If we can put a framework around it, I think that would be a positive step forward.
Great, thank you. Craig, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, I agree with Gary's comments.
Wonderful. All right, next question. Our DC study is underway and our new bylaw must be passed in 2015. What requirements apply?
Until the legislation is in effect, you would be using, obviously, the existing framework. And what we've been doing to date has been really encouraging municipalities to not delay. The last thing I want is for municipalities to not have a valid DC bylaw in place. So we've been really clear that proceed with your process. even with the legislation in the House, I'm always wary of presuming the outcome of that. So you have an existing framework, and I would, until otherwise, I would be wary of deviating from that.
And Trevor, Krieger, that's certainly the approach that we're taking with a number of studies that we have underway, that we're just proceeding under the current legislation. I think that's the only thing that we can do. Going back to the 97 Act, it certainly, I know we're not as comprehensive a review this time, but the first reading of the 97 Act was very different than what finally received royal assent. So we're just moving forward with the legislation as it's worded today.
I agree as well. We've been following the course of the current act. I think we've acknowledged as stuff is arising, and if we have some level of depth in defining all of this material before we finalize the DC study, that will be providing commentary and potentially, if we're able to, provide a calculation to if it's going to add additional funds to them, then maybe they can take that information, and within a year, the DC study has a year to apply, that you can make the adjustments to the study. But that's only if we have the details of what the information is and the timing works out.
Great, thank you. We are running a little bit out of time, so any questions that we don't get answered during this Q&A session, our experts will answer them, and we will send the answers back to everyone so that everyone will have access to the answers. Next question: what effect will the changes to voluntary payment have on city/local contribution splits for services?
Can you just read the last part of it again, please?
What effect will the changes to voluntary payment have on city/local contribution splits for service?
Well, I guess without a specific example, it's difficult to answer. But I guess, you know, if it's not allowed, then your abilities are taken away, and you'll have a cost that you'll just have to bear, and without any ability to any recourse to try and recover it from the developer.
Great, thank you. Next question: will area-specific DCs impact existing service such as water and wastewater funding requirements, or can those be considered town-wide?
I think that we're going to wait to see if there's anything prescribed and the area rating. You know, many municipalities now, if they've got really distinct water and wastewater service areas, are calculating them on those bases. But there are some that, even when they're distinct, establish municipal-wide DC charges. So it's a difficult question to answer at this point in time, as it's just going to come out through the regulations and whether prescriptions might be.
Yeah, I think the key thing is what the Act is asking us to do is to have a dialogue. And I know I've just did a public meeting a couple of nights ago where, you know, the development community, who historically have liked the area-specific charges, have turned around now and they want to combine the charges and average everything out. They're seeing having these dispersions in between different areas, causing some problems when you're competing in the same housing market, and I'm building the exact same house as you, but I'm, you know, over in this community and I've got an extra $10,000 development charge more than you do, so it causes a little bit of disparity within the housing market.
Great, thank you. Next question. The amendments don't appear to have any real teeth for contravention under the proposed Section 59. What are the envisioned penalties other than a recovery of investigation costs?
So I'll take a stab at that. 100% right. And as I think I said off the top, I don't have an armed forces branch in my ministry. So what we're really doing is trying to enhance the accountability and transparency. And so I think with the additional reporting requirements, I think with the certificate as well, there's a lot there for the local community to make decisions on if they feel appropriate actions have been taken and how they need to address that at the local level. Obviously, there are sticks that the ministry has, but I don't, ultimately, and people know this, working for municipalities for a while, is that really, these type of matters, I think, are best resolved locally. And with this enhanced reporting, I think it'll just make it a much more transparent conversation.
All right. Next question, is the requirement for increased annual reporting about non-DC funding sources mainly a concern about municipalities double dipping and using park dedication funds for DC funded projects?
I can take a stab at that one as well. So what we found, and I'm no expert in either Section 37 or parkland dedication, but what I do know is, being the area that collects the FIR data, we do collect a little bit on parkland dedication. We don't really collect much on Section 37. When we started to do some digging into sort of what the patterns were out there, or what the monies were utilized for, there just wasn't really a lot of consistency in the reporting, or we couldn't even really find a lot of information. So I think before I even insinuate that there's some deceptive activity going on out there, I think the biggest thing was we just wanted to standardize it, so the collection and reporting on this information was done in a manner that, for hundreds of millions of dollars we're talking about, is done in a somewhat consistent manner, and made available to council, because once you make these reports available to council, it's available to the general public. So that's really, the underlying desire there.
Great, thank you. Next question, if you are trying to direct growth for financial efficiency reasons to cover the cost of growth, is there a component related to the cost of growth arising from climate change impacts of growth?
So I'll step in, and maybe Gary or Craig will have opinions on this too, but I think we have to go back to sort of the first principles of what the DCA is about, and the scope of the review that we had, and we really weren't looking at changing what that was. And then the basis is that this is a mechanism for municipalities to recover a component of the growth-weighted capital costs of new infrastructure. And I completely appreciate the element, climate change, and obviously there may be issues of climate change adaptation that work their way into the infrastructure you built, and you'll look at it that way. But I'm not sure, and Gary and Craig, you may have opinions on that as well. I don't know if we're asking, is there going to be a climate change charge in a future DCA? I didn't envision that, but you might have thoughts.
I'll jump in. Gary here. I've been working with a group that is across Canada, and a lot of it centered here in Ontario, and part of what they're looking at is the impact of climate change. And they're looking at it as stormwater related, and as well wastewater and water. And as I understand, what they'll be looking to do is to release a number of white papers. I think there's 7 of them that they'll be looking to release over the next year. So those type of initiatives obviously will find their way to the appropriate people in the province. And I think, all I can really say is, there's the potential over time we may see further changes through the regulation. But right now, there's nothing there, either being recommended from these groups or I think being considered by the province.
Further to that, I think that we're already seeing some reflection of those kinds of impacts from the capital programming side, and what infrastructure and facilities are needed due to development, and stormwater management is a huge one, or a big one. And so the degree to which climate change impacts how municipalities plan for and deliver services that are already eligible for funding under the Act, I think we're going to pick those up. If it's something distinct and unique, we'll have to address what those are and see if we can do it within the confines of the current legislation and future legislation.
Great, thank you. This one is for Trevor. Was there any thought given to making more explicit the requirements related to funding exemptions, both mandatory, example, industrial additions, school board development, and non-mandatory, example, downtown DC exemption incentive?
It definitely came up. So there was definitely some stakeholders who felt that we should be much more prescriptive in making a whole bunch of things exempt or discounted. And we part of the consultation process was an education process, I think, for some people, and that teaching them how the DCA is set up and what that means for municipalities. And in this regard, what we really had to talk about was every dollar you take out of the DCA doesn't mean that the municipality is not spending that dollar. That's got to come from another source. So we're always wary of mandating anything without knowing the broader fiscal picture for our community. So, and the fact that, as I mentioned before, so many municipalities already adopt these practices when dealing with things like downtown revitalization. What I would say is that, again, I think this would be a much better issue to be dealt with through our forum, potentially through some additional materials to help best practices. I ideally don't want to be in the business of mandating discounts for municipalities.
Great, thank you. And we're going to do one last question. We'd like to receive a bit of clarification for, so Bill 73 states that if one building that requires more than one permit, that the DC is payable when the first permit is issued, sorry. So this provision only applies to singular buildings, not 150 single-family dwellings in a residential subdivision. One more time.
That's certainly my reading.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, unless Trevor's going to say something different.
No, I wasn't going to disagree. The only thing I was going to say is, this is the kind of thing I'd confirm with my lawyer before answering when I get that specific, but the intention when we were developing it, what was that, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So just a quick reminder that MFOA has some upcoming training. Is offering DC 101 and 201 workshops in Kingston, Brampton, and London. You will receive the best deal when you sign up for both at the same time. So definitely check that out today. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Trevor from MMH, Craig from Hempson Consulting, and Gary from Watson Associates for joining us today. It has been a pleasure to have you all with us. And please remember to download the webinar materials and to take a few minutes to complete the evaluation that we will be sending you after this broadcast. Thank you so much for your continual feedback and participation. For additional resources on a broad range of topics, please visit MFOA's virtual library. The library is your one-stop shop for policies, RFPs, guides, legislations, and regulations from across the province. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.